أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters in Islam. Welcome back to Qur'an study, Surah Mulk. Today, inshallah, we're going to be studying verse 25 and 26. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He accepts our ibadah in these blessed nights and allow us to draw closer to the Qur'an. In the last verse, my dear brothers and sisters, we saw yet another attempt at da'wah, where our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was instructed, "Qul, say ya Rasulullah," to these stubborn individuals who are still in denial. Remind them of Allah's favors, how He created them and gave them sensory faculties and gave them emotional intelligence, and then He multiplied them, and then He gave them resources so they can sustain themselves, so they can not just survive but thrive. And mind you, all of this was on the tongue of the Prophet ﷺ, because the Prophet was someone they knew. They saw him grow up. They thought highly of him before he declared prophethood. Now you would think that after all this, they would at least somewhat soften up. They'll be at least somewhat curious. They would at least try to listen somewhat intently. But instead, what we get is sarcasm, which is captured in today's verses 25 and 26. To understand their sarcasm, if y'all recall, the last verse ended with وَإِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ, and it is to Allah that you will be gathered back. So what these rejectors do is that they literally ignored everything the Prophet ﷺ said about Allah's favors and how they need to be more grateful. They literally tune all that out and they just latch on to this last phrase about returning back to Allah. And they say to the Prophet ﷺ, وَيَقُولُونَ مَتَى هَذَا الْوَعْدُ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. So when is this promise going to come to pass if you're telling the truth? Like they're telling the Prophet ﷺ, if you are legit, if you are for real, let's see some action. Let's see when this threat is going to come to pass. And this tells you, once again, my dear brothers and sisters, they are not genuinely listening. They are just looking for one or two phrases that they can harp on, so they can mock the Prophet ﷺ, so they can retort and ridicule. And subhanAllah, we saw at the very beginning of this surah that when these types of individuals will end up in hellfire, they will admit then, لَوْ كُنَّا نَسْمَعُ أَوْ نَعْقِلُ. If we had only listened, if we were only being more attentive, we would not be here right now. But right now, unfortunately, in the life of this world, بَلَّجُّوا فِي عُتُوٍّ وَنُفُورٍ, they persist in their insolence and in their avoidance of truth, that no matter what the Prophet ﷺ says, no matter what motivation and positive enforcement and negative enforcement that is channeled their way, it's falling on deaf ears. Now, some scholars do say that it's possible that maybe they're not mocking and they actually do just want to know the date of the Day of Judgment. They just want to know when this threat of divine punishment will come to pass. Even if that's true, that's still problematic. Because like imagine I'm talking to one of my students that, hey, look, you did not pass your last few quizzes and tests. Unfortunately, it was a failure grade and you have not been turning in your assignments either. And I hope it doesn't come to this, but if this continues, I'll have to call your parents and set up a meeting with the principal. And my student turns around and says, so when are you going to do it? When? And I'm like, really? That's your concern? Like, instead of being moved by the gravity of the situation and the gravity of your offense, you're worried about the timing? And this tells you one more thing. This response of theirs, this hyper fixation on timing, tells you that unless something is immediate and near, it's not really going to weigh on their conscience. They're not going to be shaken and stirred. And subhanAllah, this is a very dunyawi mindset, because dunya is actually from dana yadunu, which is something that is close and immediately accessible. Meaning these people are all about immediate gratification. When it comes to anything delayed, a little bit later, it doesn't hold the same value in their eyes. And subhanAllah, in psychology, we know this phenomenon. This is known as future discounting, where people disvalue things that are a little bit later in the future. And Allah captures this in the Qur'an. إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا. They see the Day of Judgment as this far-fetched, out in the future thing, if at all. And therefore, they discount the warnings, they dismiss the threats, and they're not taking it seriously at all. Now, subhanAllah, from psychology, we also know, based on the famous Stanford experiment, that it is delayed gratification that is tied to so many different measures of success. And subhanAllah, the word for being delayed or being later is akhir or akhirah. Subhanallah. Like our deen is setting us for success, not just here, but also there. So they tell the Prophet ﷺ, when is this threat going to come to pass if you are a legit prophet? SubhanAllah, just their fearlessness, my dear brothers and sisters, because they used to call the Prophet Sadiq and Ameen. They told the Prophet when he climbed the mountain to first take his message publicly, they said, Ma jarrabna bika kadiban. We have not ever seen you lie. We have never experienced a lie from you. And now they're turning around and telling the same Prophet, oh, let's see some action. Let's see the punishment. Like, they're so secure. Amintum man fis samaya. They're so casual. They're so fearless. So Allah tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Qul innamal ilmu indallah wa innama ana nadhirun mubin." Say, Allah alone has knowledge of this, and I'm only here to give a clear warning. In other words, only Allah knows the actual date of the Day of Judgment. In fact, in the hadith of Jibreel, we were told, "Mal mas'ulu anha bi'a'lama min as-sa'il." Neither Jibreel knows, neither our Prophet ﷺ knows. This is something that Allah has kept exclusively with Himself. So the Prophet tells him, "Innama ana nadhirun mubin." I am just a clear warner. That even though I don't know the date of this warning, that does not take away from the seriousness of my warning. Why are you brushing it off? Why are you so casually dismissing it? Since you don't know the time, it could be around the corner and you may get blindsided. And subhanAllah, my dear brothers and sisters, this phrase, Innama ana nadhirun mubin. Nadhir. This once again is a throwback to the beginning of the surah. That when these individuals are being interrogated in the fire, the warden of hell will say, Alam ya'tikum nadhir. Didn't a warner come to you? Then they will say, yes, but we dismissed him as a liar. We made fun of him. And then they will say, Law kunna nasma'u aw naqilu. If we only listened and understood. By the way, notice they reference 2 of the 3 faculties we saw in the previous ayah. Listening and understanding. Now, after all this back and forth, all the evidence and motivation that's presented, one may wonder, like, are these stubborn folks ever going to budge? Are they ever going to believe? Allah tells you in the next verse, فَلَمَّا رَأَوْهُ زُلْفَةً سِيئَتْ وُجُوهُ الَّذِينَ كَفْرُوا. They will believe when they finally see the punishment, unfortunately. And this right here is the 3rd sensory faculty, which is now also being referenced. SubhanAllah, how it comes full circle. And how the ayahs connect. On this note though, this whole idea of believing only when you see something, or seeing is believing. This is very prevalent in our time, where people will just outright reject the unseen, that unless I can put it under the microscope or the telescope, stop bothering me. I tell these individuals whose epistemology is, I only believe what I see. I tell these individuals that actually majority of your knowledge is unseen. Like, take history for instance. You believe in the existence of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and the existence of Athens back in history. Well, there was no video camera at that time to record that footage. So why do we believe it? Well, because there are other sources of knowledge than just seeing. We believe in the existence of atoms. We know that a Big Bang occurred. None of this stuff is on a video. We believe in the existence of protons and neutrons, but we cannot see them under a microscope. We trust generally the knowledge that comes to us from our textbooks. We rely on journalists to tell us news events, even though we're not the ones on the ground live observing those events go down. Even the judge in the court, he doesn't see the crime. He takes the words of the witnesses who observed it. It's unseen to the judge, seen to the witnesses. In fact, even the calorie count on the back of a food box, it's untested, unseen to you whether that number is legit. So then why do you believe it? Because you're trusting the word of an expert. This is what you call testimonial knowledge. And as human beings, it's impossible for us to verify every single claim and study every claim. Our lives are not big enough for this. So practicality demands that we learn to trust expert testimonials. In fact, if I were to ask you right now, how do you know that you actually belong to your parents? That you actually came from your parents? You might say DNA, but the fact that you know DNA works is based on expert testimonial. And 20, 30 years ago, when they didn't have the DNA testing, what were they relying on then? They were relying on the birth certificate. Once again, testimonial knowledge, where a doctor who saw the event testifies to the fact that you belong to your parents, seen to the doctor, unseen to you. And there's no way to physically verify it, at least in those days. So that being said, we rely on the expert testimonial of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whose character is in the full light of history, his accomplishments, his character, his virtues, his humility, his selflessness, his worship, his spirituality. We have so much data about him that we have no reason to doubt his testimony. So we are being completely reasonable when we trust the unseen in light of his testimony, because that's what human beings do all the time. The radius of what you can see with your own five senses is actually very limited. And I always tell people who are so gung-ho about like seeing is believing, I'm like, what privilege is seeing as this some infallible thing? We saw in the last session that according to scientists, seeing is very prone to biases and distortions and modulation. People are very divergent in the way they perceive things with their eyes, which is why I suggested that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word absar in the plural. So back to the ayah. Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, tell them that the knowledge of the Day of Judgment is only with Allah, and you are here solely to give them, to deliver them a plain warning. One last benefit I'd like to point out, my dear brothers and sisters, if you recall, they were being really sarcastic to the Prophet ﷺ about this whole Day of Judgment thing, right? When is it going to happen? When is this going to go down? And when the Prophet ﷺ responded, he did not reciprocate their sarcasm. He actually gave them a dignifying response. Even though they were willing to demean him and stoop in the gutter in terms of their behavior, mukibban ala wajhihim, the Prophet is not going to do the same. He's going to take the high road, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Because the Prophet understands they are not his teachers. Jibreel is his teacher. Allah is his teacher. So you look at the adab of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he responds to them in a way as if they actually asked a legitimate question. Subhanallah. And speaking of Jibreel being the mentor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know what Jibreel would tell the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? This hadith, by the way, that comes in Tabari and others, is the summary of the high bar of good etiquettes and akhlaq that Islam sets. Jibreel tells the Prophet ﷺ that Allah commands you أن تصل من قطعك وتعطي من حرمك وتعفو عمن ظلمك. Allah commands you that you mend the ties with those who try to break away from you, especially referring to family. Someone's trying to cut you out of their lives, you still make an effort to connect. Number two, that you give to those who deprive you and you forgive those who oppress you. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is the gold standard our Prophet is being asked to uphold. And you see that here in the way he responded to them. Which is why in the very next surah, Surah Al-Qalam, Allah will say, إِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. You're upon an amazing standard of character. Because our Prophet was the walking Qur'an after all. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we learn from the prophetic personality, that we learn the art of da'wah, and deeply engage with Allah's book. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.